What's up guys, this is Tcg Sam here, and in today's video I'm coming at you guys with my first place World Championship celebration, Tenpai Dragon list. So even though it did get hit, I still feel like it's one of the best decks of the format, and I think now there are a couple of different ways you can go about playing it. And I chose to play the Sky Striker cards and more board breakers, which I'll explain once we get there in the profile. But without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. So starting off with the Tenpai lineup, it's still fairly standard. 2 Pydra and 1 copy of Dora. I usually like the 3 Pydra more than Dora, but now that sangen summoning's at 1, I just thought Dora might be a more suitable normal summon most of the time, because Pydra's not able to get as much value as often. Regardless, these are still both 1 card OTKs, so it doesn't really matter, but I think Dora is pretty nice of a normal summon, and arguably a better one than Pydra, since you can access Pydra later on in the combo. And then, of course, for the rest of the Tenpais, 3 copies of Chandra, very standard. I chose to play 2 copies of Genroku. I always wanted my Kaiman to be able to get full value, and Genroku is another starter. It's not an ideal one, of course, because it does remove the body off the board if it does get ashed, and it does take up a normal summon if you hard draw it. So not the best starter in some sense, but I still feel like this deck needed some extra consistency, so I chose to play 2. And then 1 copy of Fadra. I really do not like this card at more than 1. You can choose to play more than 1, but with this build, I figured since I wasn't playing Desires, and from my experience, it rarely ever comes up. There are cases where I wish I had a second one, but I know if I choose to play 2, I'm going to end up seeing it more often than not, which is not something you really want to do, because this card really doesn't do that much by itself. For the rest of the engine, of course, the 1 copy of Summoning, 3 copies of Kaiman, and then 1 copy of Pot of Prosperity. Of course, the terraforming to search out the sangen summoning, but then now I'm choosing to play Set Rotation and Way Where There's a Will. Essentially, these are extra copies of your consistency cards. Set Rotation, of course, can get you to the sangen summoning. Way Where There's a Will essentially is a Pot of Prosperity going second. You can argue it's a little better in the sense that, your opponent doesn't take half damage. You can argue it's a little worse since you have to put a card back from your hand to the bottom of the deck, but regardless, it functionally acts as a Pot of Prosperity, allowing you to dig deeper into your deck to see your starters. And of course, you just need another field spell for Set Rotation. So I thought this was the best one and the most appropriate one. And then now for, I guess, the not standard part of my deck, I chose to play a Sky Striker engine, and the engine was 3 copies of Engage, 1 Shark Cannon, 1 Widow Anchor, 1 Afterburners, and 1 Hornet Drones. So the reason why I chose to play this was because I thought the Sky Striker cards were actually pretty solid at going second. Worst case scenario, these are always going to trade 1-for-1 like Mecha Widow Anchors and Afterburners. And I felt that most decks only really had like a few problematic monsters on their end board that you needed to get rid of before your other board breakers would work. So for example, in the Yugioh matchup, Varudras is something you could force out with this. I figured that this was a pretty solid engine to go with. In some sense, it was also pseudo consistency for the deck, not only because I'm playing only spell board breakers, so Engage will sometimes draw you a card as well, but also because Engage searching Hornet Drones into Kagari add back drones, make Hida, and a Hida crashing into an opponent's monster is actually not a terrible play, because then you can access your Genroku off the Hida, and then summon Genroku and do all your stuff in the battle phase anyways. So that was the idea behind this Striker engine. Pseudo consistency and decent in terms of board removal. From my experience, it was fairly solid. Throughout the event, I didn't really have any complaints about it. I did resolve Engage drawing cards a couple of times, and that was pretty strong. I'm not really sure if I'd continue to go with this in the future, but at least in theory for this deck, it was okay. And that was because we were playing Spellboard Breakers from now on. 3 copies of Raigeki. I still think Raigeki is very strong. There's only really Desiree that you have to worry about stopping like your board breakers this format, and I think that just having so many of them to the point where it doesn't matter if your opponent has Desiree or not, because you're just gonna have multiple board breakers, is very strong, and I think that Raigeki is definitely still a very powerful card. Next up, 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet. It's probably one of the best board breakers in the game. I don't really need to say much about this. I chose the main deck 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone as well. Not only is it very good into specifically Desiree, but I think that being able to trade with like IP as well in the Spell and Trap Zone is also very strong. And I chose to play 2 copies of Lightning Storm. Just extra copies of Mass Removal I think was really strong, especially being able to potentially hit back row or monsters. I really like the flexibility of this card, because I just personally thought that board killers were incredibly strong this format. 2 copies of Talents next. Talents, I guess, was sort of like the last card I put in. I felt like Talents could be decent, especially because it is not only an extra spell, it does make it so you can punish those hand traps a little bit more and give yourself a little bit extra consistency, or if your hand's already good enough, you can punish your opponents by stealing something or ripping something from their hand. And overall, I felt like it was okay throughout the day. And then, of course, the last and only hand trap I played in the main deck was 3 copies of Shifter. This card is way too strong not to play, I think. And even though I'm choosing to play the Striker Engine with all those spells, I still felt like Shifter was way too good of a card that just wins you so many matchups. You just have to play it in Tenpai, I feel like. So overall, a few things I want to say about the main deck. It was sort of a very experimental thing. I figured that spell board breakers were actually fairly strong in the upcoming format. I didn't want to risk having like 2 hand traps and just having your opponent play through it anyways, and just having a hand of like hand traps that don't do anything. My thought was like, okay, I'm gonna let my opponent play, and most of the top decks like Yugioh, Snake Eyes, even Tenpai Mirrors, like they're not going to do anything super crazy turn 1 to where like multiple board breakers won't break. So I felt like it was okay in that sense. Playing the board breakers also gave you a better matchup into your previously bad matchups like Runic Stun. So that's something I really liked as well. But something I will say is this is a lot weaker in the mirror when they force you to go first, because you don't have a lot of cards that are very good going first. Like the striker cards are okay going first, but sometimes they're just not going to be able to get full value, and they're just not going to be super great interruptions. And against other decks like Branded or Chimera that put up boards that are actually not really board breakable, so like things like Diabells or Puppet, for example, that is another weakness of this deck. If you play against those matchups, it's going to be a lot worse without hand traps. So that was sort of a concession I made when playing this deck. Overall, I'd say the main deck was okay. Like I mentioned, it was very experimental. I didn't even know the World Championship Celebration event was happening that weekend, so when I showed up, I just had to play with what I had essentially, which thankfully ended up working out. But in the future, I don't know if I'd change anything in the main deck if I were to continue playing this. I think maybe I would change up my side deck a little bit to respect those other decks like Branded. Moving on to the extra deck, I played 1 copy of Kagari for the Hornet Drones play, 1 copy of Seals for going first. Nightmare Phoenix was the 15th card in my extra deck. I wanted to have the option of extra spell and trap removal with this Sky Striker engine since I wasn't playing jamming waves in the main deck. I thought that just using a single engage or Hornet Drones to make this a trade 1-for-1 with like back row or something wouldn't be terrible. Never came up, and in the future I'm not really sure if I'd play it. 1 copy of Hida. I also never made the play with Hornet Drones making this and then crashing into something, but in theory it's actually pretty strong because if you're actually struggling for engine, then you essentially have 4 extra copies of starters as well, which is actually fairly good. 1 copy of Little Knight also didn't make it. 1 copy of Princess also didn't make it. So essentially, out of all the links, the only ones I ever went into were like these 2 throughout the day. In theory, the Sky Striker engine does help you link climb a lot better. So you probably should be playing the Raging Phoenix and Zelantis line. I just didn't have the cards on me, so I didn't end up playing them. But if I were to choose to play this again in the future and I had access to them, I definitely choose to play them because the Striker stuff does help you link climb a lot better. And then for the synchros, they're all fairly standard, nothing crazy here. 2 copies of Bident, 1 copy of Samurai Destroyer for the Yubel matchup, 1 copy of Moonlight Dragon, 1 copy of Black Rose Dragon, 1 copy of Meteor Burst Dragon, so nothing crazy with the 7s. I didn't play Kui Belt, that was a last minute takeout for Nightmare Phoenix. I actually initially wasn't even playing Shifter in my main deck, hence why I left my Kui Belt at home when I got there. But once I found out it was the World Championship event, I figured I should put Shifter back in my deck. So I ended up being able to get Shifters, but I couldn't get Kui Belt, so I just ended up not playing it. I would probably choose to play it in the future just because you do want to have it as an OTK line under Shifter, but thankfully it didn't really come up for me today. And then 1 copy of Transcendent Dragon, 1 copy of Ruddy Rose Dragon, and then finally 1 copy of Trident Dragon. So fairly standard extra deck. The only thing I would change is probably Phoenix to something more useful. Side deck was something very last minute and definitely not a very optimized one, but I can explain what I was thinking behind each of the cards. 3 copies of Dogwood. The idea with Dogwood was, I guess, not only for time, because this deck usually doesn't go into time, but also for the cases where I thought my opponent was going to force me to go first. I essentially just wanted to have a card that would let me live a turn, and then next turn I could sort of push back and OTK them from there. But I never really ended up doing that in practice, even when I thought my opponent was forcing me to go first. So in the future, I might end up cutting this. I ended up siding 3 copies of Ash. The idea with 3 copies of Ash was against those slightly worse matchups, like I mentioned, like Branded and Chimera, where you kind of have to have something for their key cards. Decks like 60-card grass decks as well. I just want to have extra cards that would be able to help hit those huge blowout cards in those matchups, which board breakers wouldn't necessarily be able to deal with. It's also good against Runic Stun as well, and which is still not a great matchup. Overall, I felt like Ash was pretty strong. I did end up siding it a few times as an extra hand trap as well in certain matchups, so I think in the future I might just end up siding more copies of hand traps in the side deck. Did choose to play one copy of Jamming Waves just for those back row matchups. I sided it in a few times, but I never ended up searching it. For the going first cards, I was playing one copy of Grand Test Dragon. This is just a target off of seals. Use it in pretty much every single matchup. Is really strong. The way I play this deck going first, I'm always going for seals as opposed to some like crazy synchro board or anything. And I feel like having Grand Test Dragon in the main deck is very strong because it just makes it so your seals is a lot better of a card. Yes, it does suck to draw, but I think it's worth it. It's still worth playing. And it's been pretty good for me in practice. One copy of Quackimir Drago against the Light and Dark decks. It's especially good against Yugioh. They don't really have too many outs to it once you're able to establish it. So I think definitely you want this as a huge blowout against those Light and Dark decks. One copy of Rivalry. Still a very strong card against certain matchups. And then for the other going first cards, I played a suite of Solemn cards. 3 copies of Judgment and 2 copies of Strike. The idea with this was when I was building the side deck, I really didn't know what people are going to play this format at my locals, and in my mind I was thinking, okay, I just want as many generic cards as possible for these matchups. They also have the potential to not be terrible going second as well, and what I mean by that is like you can either simplify the game state with hand traps to where these traps are able to be set for a turn and then gain value on the following turn, or you're able to break their board enough to where you're setting this and giving yourself some extra time to survive or whatever. So I felt like overall the Solemn cards were fairly strong. I did end up using Judgment a few times. I never saw Strike, so I don't really know how good it is. But in theory, these are cards that just hit every single matchup and are fairly good for even when you don't know whether you're going first or second. But in the future, I think I might be a little greedier and choose to play more targeted cards that are very good in certain matchups. So things like Power Filter, just so you have those huge blowouts that are almost auto wins on their own. I think that having those cards are very important when you're playing a deck like Tenpai and you're forced to go first because your end board just really isn't strong enough on its own. You generally need to back it up with some other huge blowouts as well. That's going to do it for the deck list. Overall, I felt like the deck performed fine. It is a bit weaker to those decks like Branded, but it worked totally okay against those decks like Snake Eyes and Yugioh from my experience. So overall, even though it is a little bit more experimental, I think I might choose to go back to hand traps in the future, but I feel like this is another way to play Tenpai that's just as viable. But regardless of whether you choose to play hand traps or board breakers, I feel like the Tenpai deck is still very strong and definitely one that should be respected. So with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. And with all that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.